A white passenger told a black CEO's twins to stop talking, but he had no idea who their uncle really was, and the entire cabin went silent. A white passenger told the black CEO's twins to stop talking, believing he could silence children with nothing but attitude. He didn't realize their uncle was on board, a man whose presence alone could quiet an entire cabin. The moment those words left his mouth, the whole flight shifted. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses, the second true authority enters the room. "Can you two stop talking for 5 minutes?" he snapped, twisting around in his seat, his voice sharp and cold. The sound silenced the soft hum of first class. Kael's mouth froze mid-sentence, his hand still gesturing toward his tablet, while Laren, caught off guard, instinctively lowered his voice and glanced uncertainly at his father. Kendric Marlow, seated in 2A beside them, slowly lifted his eyes from his tablet, the cool blue light of a confidential acquisition document still glowing faintly against his face. His gaze narrowed, locked on the back of the man who had just spoken. Kendric didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat still, measuring the weight of what had just been said, not just the words, but the tone, the posture, the entitlement behind them. Cray had already shown signs of irritation before the plane even left the ground, sighing audibly when the boys buckled their seatbelts too loudly, shifting in his chair when they laughed during boarding. But this was different. "Excuse me," Kendric said finally, his voice calm but deliberate, edged with the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be felt. Cray didn't turn around. He faced forward again, lips pressed into a thin, self-satisfied line. His body language made it clear he had said what he wanted to say, and in his mind, that was enough. Kendric studied him for another few seconds, noting the stiff posture, the slight twitch of his fingers against the armrest, the way his right shoulder subtly lifted as if bracing for conflict. He wasn't just irritated. He was establishing dominance. The flight attendant didn't notice. She was at the other end of the cabin, bracing herself near the galley wall as the plane rocked slightly through a patch of early turbulence. To the casual observer, it was nothing, a simple moment of passenger discomfort. But to Kendric, it was something else entirely. He turned to his sons. "You okay?" he asked softly. Kael gave a small nod, still wide-eyed. Laren looked up and tried to smile, his voice a whisper. "We weren't being that loud." "No, you weren't," Kendric said. "Keep talking if you want to." But inside, something else was stirring. Kendric Marlow was not just a father. He was a seasoned CEO, a man who had spent 2 decades mastering the art of silence and strategy. He'd walked into boardrooms where people looked past him, interrupted him, doubted him, not for his skill or his record, but for what they saw first. And Cray's tone, that impatient bark coated in civility, was all too familiar. It wasn't about the boys' volume. It wasn't even about their presence. It was about power. He glanced back at his tablet, but the numbers on the screen no longer held his attention. Behind the calculated words of the merger proposal he'd been reviewing, his mind now worked on something else. Why Cray was here, what his presence meant, and whether this was coincidence or something far more deliberate. The plane steadied slightly and the usual rhythm of flight resumed, fingers tapping softly on screens, newspapers rustling, someone coughing lightly in the back. But the peace was deceptive. The real turbulence was now inside the cabin, not in the air, but in the undercurrent of unspoken tension. Kendric leaned his head back, eyes closed briefly, his breathing steady. He had taught his sons to use their voices, to be curious, to ask questions, especially in spaces where people expected them to shrink. And now, on a plane headed for a major tech summit where they were scheduled to present their first AI-driven drone prototype, they were being told to be quiet, by a man who couldn't even be bothered to address them with decency. He reopened his eyes. Cray hadn't moved. His posture was smug, settled, like a man who believed the matter had been dealt with. But Kendric saw something else. Insecurity masked as authority. A need to control masked as etiquette. And something about the way Cray said it told him this wasn't just about volume, it was about control. Cray's finger had barely left the call button before the chime echoed through the cabin like a warning bell. The passengers in the first-class section of Virion Flight 1142 looked up instinctively, most returning to their screens or books after a brief glance, except for Kendric Marlow. He sat still, spine straightened subtly in his seat, his eyes never leaving the man just ahead of him. Marin Vale, a lanky flight attendant with a clipboard tucked under one arm and turbulent stiffened posture, approached row 2 with a smile that tried to stay neutral but was already halfway to uneasy. Cray wasted no time. He leaned toward Marin with the authority of someone used to being listened to in boardrooms and courtroom depositions. "Excuse me," Cray said, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "but these two have been disruptive since takeoff. I paid for a quiet first-class experience, not a daycare center." Kendric didn't move. He simply turned his head and observed. Marin's gaze flicked to Kael and Laren, seated upright, hands resting politely on the armrests, their chatter long gone quiet. Then Marin's eyes moved to Kendric, but not for long. The flight attendant crouched slightly and addressed the boys. "Are you both okay?" he asked gently. Kendric opened his mouth to respond, to explain the situation, to clarify, but Marin raised a hand without looking at him and said, "Sir, I'm asking them." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They sliced through Kendric's composure with surgical precision. A subtle displacement, not outright disrespect, but a redirection that left no room for his authority as their father, nor his identity as a man who had navigated decades of veiled exclusion behind calm eyes and tailored suits. Kael nodded cautiously. "Yes, we're okay," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Laren added, "We're just talking about our drone presentation." Marin stood, forced a quick nod, and replied, "All right then, thank you," before turning and walking back up the aisle. As he did, Cray's expression shifted into a satisfied smirk, lips pressed thin, the corners of his mouth twitching with smug satisfaction, as if the exchange had confirmed something for him. Something ugly. Kendric didn't react, not yet, but his thumb tapped once against the bezel of his tablet, a tiny gesture only someone who knew him intimately would recognize. He was recording, mentally for now, but with a level of detail that would rival a stenographer's transcript. The cabin remained in a tense quiet for several minutes. Then Cray twisted again, more dramatically this time. The seat creaked as he turned and stared directly at Kendric. "You should teach your kids how to behave in public," he said. Louder now, no longer under his breath. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a rebuke. Silence rippled across the row like a dropped stone in still water. A businessman across the aisle, a man in his late 40s with rimless glasses and a wedding ring, looked up from his tablet, clearly caught off guard. He hesitated, unsure whether to say something, before quietly lowering his eyes again. Kael's shoulders tensed beside his father. Laren blinked rapidly, his confidence flickering. The insult wasn't masked anymore. It had stepped into the open, as though Cray no longer felt the need for civility. Kendric drew a slow breath through his nose. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thinner. The thrum of the engines hummed beneath his feet like distant thunder. He leaned forward, not far, just enough to draw even with Cray's headrest, and spoke with a voice so composed it chilled the space between them. "I suggest you keep your comments to yourself." Cray chuckled, low and cruel. He turned halfway again, the overhead light catching the edge of his gray hairline and sharp cheekbone. "Or what?" he asked with mock curiosity. "Going to file a complaint? Lecture me on ethics?" Kendric didn't answer. He didn't need to. He sat back slowly, eyes forward, jaw clenched tight. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just about rudeness or cultural tone deafness. There was a game being played. Kendric had seen the pattern too many times: provoke, escalate, then weaponize the reaction. But this time, he wasn't going to play into it. He'd build the response like he built his company, quietly, methodically, and with the kind of precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Cray didn't turn again right away. Perhaps even he could feel that something intangible had tilted. Kendric wasn't just a father defending his children. He was something more, something Cray hadn't accounted for. And that miscalculation would soon cost him more than a few sideways glances. Because while Cray might have thought he was silencing children, what he was really doing was triggering a storm that had been trained, tested, and refined in boardrooms, audits, and courtrooms for decades. The restraint in Kendric's voice wasn't fear, it was precision. Cray's voice sliced through the soft hum of Virion Flight 1142 like a misplaced blade. "Entitled brats. Everyone thinks they're special now," he muttered, not under his breath enough for the comment to go unnoticed. In row 4, Dorian Vale's fingers paused mid-page. He slowly lowered the paperback novel in his lap and adjusted the discreet earpiece tucked beneath the curl of his right ear. The words had echoed too clearly, deep, abrasive, and familiar. A quick pulse of recognition fired through him. That voice. He'd heard it before. He sat straighter, eyes narrowing, posture now military precise. Dorian, Kendric Marlow's younger brother, was not just another economy passenger with a window seat. He was a cybersecurity analyst for Virathon Systems and a former federal conflict negotiator, trained to de-escalate crises before they exploded. But more importantly, he had been running digital trace operations for the company's upcoming counter-acquisition strategy, a task that had him reviewing hours of corporate espionage surveillance. And Cray's voice, the cold, entitled arrogance of it, had once surfaced in a flagged audio file from a shadow meeting involving suspicious drone IP theft. He reached into his messenger bag, pulled out his phone, and opened a secure app that bypassed commercial Wi-Fi. With a few quick taps, he sent an encrypted message directly to his brother's secure tablet up in row 2. "Cray, on board. I'm here." In seat 2A, Kendric's eyes flicked toward the notification. The name hit like an electrical charge. Whitner Cray, retired COO of Dovian Systems. The same Dovian Systems long suspected of data mirroring Virathon's drone prototype architecture. Cray wasn't just a nuisance anymore. He was a threat. Kendric's fingers hovered over his screen for a moment before replying, "Stand by. If he escalates, record everything." Meanwhile, Cray wasn't done. He twisted slightly again in his seat and cast a sideways glance toward the twins, his lips curled in disdain. "You'd think someone would teach these kids some manners," he muttered louder this time, eyes darting to nearby passengers as if seeking agreement. Kael's shoulders visibly stiffened. He looked down at his shoes, cheeks coloring. Laren, always more outspoken, tilted his head and asked with a confused frown, "Why are you being mean to us?" Cray jerked his neck back around. "See?" he snapped. "Disrespectful. That's the problem." Kendric leaned forward then, placing a steadying hand on Laren's arm. His eyes were calm, but a storm brewed quietly behind them. "Don't answer that," he said gently, but with unmistakable finality. His gaze locked on Cray for a beat too long, making it clear that any further escalation would not go unanswered. Dorian watched it all unfold from behind, already switching his phone's mode to silent, opening a recording window, and syncing it with the plane's audio timestamp. Every move was precise, methodical, like preparing for a surgical intervention. He kept his posture casual, his book still in his lap, but the lens of his phone was angled just enough to capture Cray's seat from afar. Back in first class, the atmosphere grew heavier, even though no one had raised their voice. A businessman in 3A glanced sideways at Cray, then at Kendric, eyebrows knitting in concern but saying nothing. The tension had entered the communal airspace now. It was no longer confined to a row, it was traveling down the aisle like a current. Kendric tapped his thumb against the metal bezel of his tablet, calculating. Cray's provocation had layers. It wasn't just irritation, it was strategic. Kendric could see it now. The subtle attempt to provoke, to disrupt, to draw attention, all while painting himself as the disturbed party. It was a maneuver as old as boardroom sabotage, create chaos, shift blame, and erode composure. Cray turned slightly and added with a smirk, "Figures." Noise without substance. Laren inhaled sharply, but Kendric squeezed his arm lightly. "Don't bite." 2 rows behind, Dorian muttered under his breath, "Classic bait." He noted Cray's posture, the angle of his shoulders, the performative tone. It was all theater. But what was the motive? Why here? Why now? He opened another secure channel and pinged the Virathon security archive. Within seconds, a flagged memo popped up. Cray had attended a private investor roundtable in Corvallis 2 days ago, one suspected of being a cover for insider coordination between rival firms. His flight was supposed to be elsewhere, so why was he here now, on this route? Dorian's eyes flicked forward. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. The next moment confirmed it. Cray leaned back once more and added with just enough volume to be heard, "People like you always think you're owed something." The tone was venomous, low, but sharp enough to puncture. This time, Kendric didn't lean forward. He simply turned his head slowly, met Cray's gaze, and said in a measured tone, "You're going to want to rethink what you just said." Cray scoffed. "Or what?" The space between them went cold. Kendric didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence was louder than any threat. Behind them, Dorian lowered his phone, his voice a whisper into his mic. Subject escalating. Confirmation on past behavior linked to classified IP incidents. Protocol trigger pending. Passengers around them had begun to notice, shifting uncomfortably, some craning to look. The businessman in 3A cleared his throat, considering whether to speak, but Kendric remained motionless, a man sharpening steel behind his stillness. Not yet, he thought. The timing had to be perfect. This wasn't just about protecting his sons anymore. It was about revealing the full picture, brick by brick, before Cray realized what was collapsing around him. The first attack had been casual, the second deliberate, but the third had left a mark, and Kendric knew what that meant. Invisibility was no longer an option. It was time to shift the frame. The request was swift and calculated. "Would you consider swapping seats with someone in the back?" Marin Vale asked softly, leaning slightly toward Kendric with the kind of forced neutrality that had more weight than it pretended to. Just to ease the tension. Kendric Marlow blinked once. The hum of the aircraft felt sharper now. "You're asking me to move," he said slowly, deliberately. "Because my sons are speaking?" Marin's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I'm trying to keep the peace, sir." For a moment, Kendric didn't answer. Around him, the air seemed to hold its breath. The passenger in 3A stole a glance over the top of a magazine. The man in 2D stopped mid-sip from his coffee. Even Kael and Laren froze, unsure whether they were in trouble or simply being moved again, something they'd experienced more times than they could count, though rarely with this level of quiet insult. Kendric's voice was flat, his expression unreadable. "Get your supervisor." There was no anger in his tone, only precision. That same tone he used in acquisition meetings when someone tried to bury a clause in subtext. Marin hesitated, then nodded and walked briskly down the aisle. Kendric turned his gaze forward again, jaw tight, his fingers gently brushing the armrest. Then it happened. Cray leaned back in his seat, a smirk crawling across his face. Without looking, he muttered just loud enough for several rows to hear, "You people love playing the victim card." It was a flicked match in a cabin full of dry air. Kendric rose, not hurriedly, not aggressively. He simply stood, tall, unflinching, precise. The motion itself was dignified, but it stopped the atmosphere cold. His silhouette towered, casting a faint shadow over Cray's shoulder. The cabin stilled. The moment hadn't escalated into a confrontation yet, but it had the weight of something historic forming right there in the silence. "You're going to apologize to my sons," Kendric said, his voice even but resolute. "Right now." Cray slowly turned, startled by the command in Kendric's tone. But his pride was faster than his sense. He stood up too, face tightening, breath shallow. "Make me," he said with mock bravado. The aisle now became a standoff, a space suspended between professionalism and provocation. Passengers craned their necks. One woman clutched her coat tighter. The businessman in 3C set his tablet down. Even the engine hum seemed to quiet in anticipation. But the response didn't come from Kendric. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice cut through the moment like a quiet blade, calm, steady, and cold with certainty. Everyone turned. Dorian Vale stepped into the aisle from the economy section, his steps unhurried but confident, like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. He wore a simple blazer over a dark shirt, and in his hand he held a slim wallet, which he opened smoothly to reveal a badge that glinted under the cabin light. Federal clearance. Clearly visible. Unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the rows. Cray's posture faltered, his smirk cracking for the first time. He glanced at the badge, then at the tall man approaching, then at Kendric, putting the pieces together a moment too late. "That man you just insulted," Dorian continued, now within 3 feet of Cray. "He's my brother." He paused and looked at Kael and Laren, who stared back with wide, unsure eyes. "And those boys? You just crossed the wrong family." Silence consumed the cabin like a curtain abruptly drawn across a stage. Cray's last smirk hadn't faded yet when he turned and found himself face to face with a dozen pairs of eyes, passengers who had up until now chosen the safety of disengagement. Now they were paying attention. The moment Dorian Vale lifted his badge, its federal clearance seal glinting in the overhead light like a flare in a dark tunnel, the entire atmosphere of the aircraft shifted. Cray's eyes narrowed, but his confidence faltered just enough to show. The flight crew, hearing the shift in tone and sensing the passengers' collective unease, arrived in a flurry. Their eyes swept the situation like firefighters arriving late to a growing blaze. Lead attendant Maren Vale looked visibly unsettled. Moments later, Director Halvin Rusk, the flight's senior supervisor, approached. He was mid-40s, salt-streaked hair, blazer over a flight vest, and the kind of facial tightness that came from too many mid-air incident reports and not enough authority to stop them. Kendric didn't rise, didn't shout. He remained seated beside his sons, anchored and direct. "I'm requesting that Mr. Cray be moved to another seat. This is targeted harassment." His voice didn't waver. Halvin blinked, glanced at Cray, then at the boys, then at Dorian. "Sir," he began, cautious, "we don't typically reassign first-class passengers unless there's a physical threat. Policy doesn't give me the authority to—" Dorian stepped forward before Halvin could finish, pulling out his phone. "Then perhaps this helps." He tapped his screen. From the speakers came Cray's own voice, sharp and unmistakable. "You people always think you're entitled. Brats don't know how to shut up. Victim card." The playback lasted only 15 seconds, but it was long enough to fracture any illusion Cray had built around plausible deniability. Halvin's composure cracked, only slightly, but enough for Kendric to lean in and add, "You can either move him now, or I file a full incident report the moment we land, and I guarantee you our legal team has the bandwidth to escalate it well beyond this cabin." Maren, who had stood to the side hoping the moment would pass, opened his mouth. "Sir, I apologize. Maybe we misunderstood how—" Kendric turned to him with precision. "It's not just about today," he said, his voice low and steady, yet somehow louder than the engines. "It's about how often this happens, and how quietly it's expected to be endured." Cray's posture shifted. He had crossed a line, and now he was exposed, publicly, audibly, and in the eyes of a watchful cabin. But still, he tried. "This was all a misunderstanding," he muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the boys. "I didn't mean—" It was Kael, quiet until now, who interrupted. His voice was small but unwavering. "You told us to stop talking because you didn't like how we looked." The cabin froze. Even the subtle hum of conversation stopped as passengers turned toward the child's voice. Laren added, staring directly at Cray, "You said we weren't behaving, but we were just being us." Cray's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His face, flushed with a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment, seemed to shrink inward. Dorian didn't move, but his expression told the room everything it needed to know. He was no longer just a brother. He was a witness, a recorder, a line in the sand. Halvin slowly reached for the tablet clipped to his waistband and keyed into the system. His hand shook slightly as he tapped in a reassignment protocol. "Mr. Cray," he said, not unkindly but with firm finality, "I'm going to need you to come with me." Cray didn't argue. He knew better now, and as he stood, gathered his coat with trembling fingers and shuffled down the aisle past passengers who no longer looked away, the only sound left was the silence of a man who had just realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. And for the first time, Cray had nothing left to say except the silence of someone finally unmasked. Halvin Rusk stood near the cockpit bulkhead, his face pale with tension as the murmurs of first-class passengers swelled behind him. The decision had been made, but the fallout was just beginning. With the eyes of nearly every passenger on him, Cray was finally ordered to change seats. It wasn't a request anymore. The supervisor's voice had been low and professional, but the implications were loud. The airline could no longer shield Cray under the guise of neutrality. Cray gathered his things with exaggerated slowness, letting out a dramatic sigh that did nothing to win sympathy. As he shuffled down the narrow aisle toward the rear of the plane, his muttering, faint but bitter, brushed past the shoulders of passengers who now openly averted their eyes. His privilege, once worn like armor, was crumbling under the weight of his own arrogance. No one stood up for him. No one nodded. He walked alone. Back in row 2, the shift was immediate. Conversations resumed, though quieter, laced with the awkwardness that lingers after confrontation. A few first-class passengers gave Kendric respectful nods, a few more whispered to one another, but no one challenged him now. Marin Vale, the flight attendant who had once tried to push Kendric to the back in the name of keeping peace, suddenly reappeared with a pair of ginger ales and forced a tight smile. "For the boys," he said, placing the drinks down with careful hands. Kendric didn't even look up. "We're fine." Marin hesitated, then stepped back. The rejection stung, but it was deserved. He returned to the galley, his steps quicker now, his presence dimmed. Kendric returned his focus to his sons. Kael was quietly sketching something in his notebook, likely another drone blueprint, while Laren had resumed flipping through a flight magazine, though his eyes were unfocused. Kendric let out a slow breath, the storm passing but far from over. In row 4, Dorian Vale tapped a command into his phone, lowering his brightness and angling the screen slightly. The recording app was still running, just in case. The lens of his secondary camera lens had captured Cray's scowls, his muttered slurs, and the federal violation that Marin and Halvin tried to manage away. He had what he needed, almost. 30 minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a patch of turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." The tone was calm, routine, nothing out of the ordinary, at least not on the surface. But Dorian noticed something that didn't match the cadence of air travel. While scanning the cabin, he caught sight of Cray seated 2 rows ahead in economy, slightly hunched over his tray table. In his hands, barely visible to the average eye, was a small phone, clearly powered despite flight mode restrictions. The glow of the screen reflected off the seat back in front of him, and more importantly, The interface, angular, encrypted, fast-moving, was familiar. Dorian leaned closer, steadying his camera and snapping a high-resolution screenshot. The app Cray was using wasn't commercial. It belonged to an internal network used by corporate intermediaries to initiate shadow trades, data bursts, or, worst, trigger automated leaks to influence stock movements. He sent the image to Kendric instantly. The alert appeared on Kendric's tablet as he reviewed a compliance model. When he opened the message and saw the interface, a cold flash of realization passed through him. He had seen that encrypted UI before, once during Verathon's pre-clearance vetting for merger compliance, and once again during the investigation into Dovian Systems' covert stock manipulation. And now, here it was, mid-air, in the hands of Whitner Cray. Kendric unbuckled his seatbelt. "Watch your brother," he said to Laren. "I'll be right back." He walked through the cabin deliberately, past startled passengers, and didn't stop until he reached the lavatory area, where Cray was now lingering near the back row, still texting rapidly with his head down. Kendric positioned himself directly in front of him, just outside the bathroom door. "Who are you messaging from a disabled device on a restricted network?" Kendric asked. His voice was low but sharp. Cray glanced up, startled but defiant. "Back off." Kendric stepped closer. "I know about Dovian Systems' backdoor deal. I know what that interface is tied to. Your NDA is still active." Cray tucked the phone halfway under his jacket, but it was too late. Dorian had the footage, and the metadata would speak louder than denials ever could. "You break it here," Kendric whispered, "and I'll make sure the FTC sees the recording." Cray's jaw tightened. His skin paled beneath the cabin's soft lighting, and for the first time since boarding the plane, he didn't speak. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space between them. It wasn't fear in Cray's eyes, it was recognition. He had underestimated the quiet man in 2A and misread the moment entirely. Kendric didn't move. He held Cray's stare for one more breath, then turned away, walking calmly back toward the front of the aircraft. As he passed a row of watching passengers, none spoke, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer passive. It was watchful. Ready. Back in row 2, Kael looked up as his father returned, but Kendric simply nodded and sat. He didn't need to explain. Dorian met his eyes briefly from row 4 and gave a single nod. The data was already archived. This wasn't just about turbulence. It wasn't even about personal harassment anymore. The attempted humiliation had been a smokescreen. Beneath it lay a corporate tactic, weaponized silence, masked as discomfort, meant to discredit, isolate, and disrupt. And now it was exposed. Kendric leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting to the future once more. This was never about volume. It was about trying to silence the competition's future before it could speak. Kendric Marlow's eyes never left his son's. Their laughter had returned, soft, hesitant, but present. It steadied him in ways logic never could. He watched Kael nudge Laren with a whispered joke, their shoulders shaking in quiet amusement. After everything, they were still trying to find joy. That, Kendric thought, was the greatest proof of resilience he had ever seen. He adjusted in his seat, glancing down at the encrypted tablet on his lap. Dorian's earlier files were already syncing to Verathon's secure server. Kendric had reviewed enough to know the report would be airtight. Audio evidence, timestamps, flight logs, digital behavior patterns, all of it framing Cray's behavior not just as harassment, but as a potential act of coordinated corporate disruption. That's when the man in row 6 stood up. Kendric noticed him first out of peripheral habit, a tall figure with close-cropped hair, business-casual blazer, and a calm, composed gait that didn't match the usual jittery movements of most passengers mid-flight. The man walked slowly toward Kendric's row, holding a folded badge between two fingers. As he reached the aisle, he leaned slightly in. "Dr. Marlow?" he asked, voice low enough not to alarm. Kendric looked up, brow raised. Name's Bren Vassal, the man continued. Legal strategist. Recently appointed to Verathon's internal counter-sabotage task force. I'm supposed to be here incognito. But what just happened? I had to intervene. Kendric blinked. Verathon sent you. The board did. I was assigned to monitor potential espionage targeting executive-level transit. He glanced down the cabin, toward where Cray had been moved. And Cray fits the pattern. You're the fifth exec he's crossed paths with. Kendric's breath hitched slightly, not from surprise, but recognition. You're saying this is coordinated? Bren nodded grimly. Same behavior, same indirect provocation, same attempts to escalate emotionally. In each case, the exec was traveling with sensitive IP. And in 3 cases, minor children were present, likely used as emotional leverage points. A silence settled between them like fog. There's more, Bren added. Cray didn't book under his name. He was flying under the alias Brennick Veller. We traced the payment method back to a shell firm, Perrin Holdings, registered out of Levin. You know who owns that shell? Kendric's mind was already there. Alteron Dynamics. Bren gave a slow nod. Same Alteron that's been lobbying to delay your South Continent Air Alliance certification. The pieces clicked into place, too cleanly to be random. Cray's irritation wasn't irritation at all. It was provocation. Disruption disguised as personal annoyance. A corporate predator hunting in the subtle margins of behavior, betting that racial microaggressions would be seen as subjective, not strategic. Kendric stared straight ahead, at the closed curtain between cabins, his jaw tightening. Cray hadn't just targeted his boys, he had attempted to exploit them as narrative weapons. Stir tension, erode confidence, trigger an outburst, any outburst. A single misstep by Kendric would have fed headlines, internal whispers, shareholder doubt, but now it had backfired. Bren leaned closer. My presence on this flight? It wasn't coincidence. We've been seeing this tactic for months. Legal can't move until we link intent to operation. Cray just gave us the missing piece. Kendric exhaled slowly. You'll file a report? Already in draft? As the cabin lights dimmed slightly for landing prep, Kendric glanced again at his sons. They were tapping away on a tablet, drawing a drone design together, sharing headphones, oblivious to the storm swirling just behind the curtain. I need to inform the board, Kendric murmured. Bren hesitated, then added, This won't stay small. Not when someone like Cray is a pawn in something bigger. Kendric finally turned to face him fully. No, it won't. He straightened his posture, eyes sharp. We'll restructure the entire approach, not just to defend. He paused, looking back toward his sons. To protect. The two men exchanged a brief, silent understanding. This was no longer a matter of one flight, one insult, or one bad actor. As Bren returned to his seat, Kendric opened a new secure line on his tablet. Beneath his fingers, the words formed, Initiate Guardian Protocol. Flight 1142. Confirmed pattern. He hit send. And in that moment, he realized this flight wasn't just about standing up, it was about standing guard. The passenger smirked, sure his command would stand unchallenged, unaware that every glare, every whisper, and every rising heartbeat was pulling the twins' uncle to his feet, a man known for ending disrespect with calm, calculated force. If you believe cruelty under entitlement always folds when strength meets strategy, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment the wheels of Virion Flight 1142 kissed the tarmac at Andros Bay International, tension still hung in the cabin air, taut and unresolved. But within seconds of deceleration, that tension found a target. Two uniformed federal agents waited at the end of the jet bridge, their postures alert, their eyes scanning the first-class manifest. Whitner Cray had barely unbuckled his seatbelt when one of them stepped inside. "Mr. Cray?" the taller agent asked, voice clear and commanding. Cray stiffened. Passengers turned. From behind, Kendric Marlow remained seated, his sons gripping each of his hands in silence. Kael glanced at the agents, then at his father's steady face. Laren's gaze followed Cray's stiff form as the agents approached. Cray's voice faltered as he asked, "What is this about?" One of the agents replied flatly, "You'll be briefed in holding. Come with us." There was no commotion, no dramatic struggle, just the sound of disbelief breaking beneath Cray's forced dignity as he was escorted through the narrow aisle, hands behind his back, jaw tight. Dorian Vale watched from row 4, phone still in hand, recording discreetly. The federal breach report he had filed mid-air, citing unauthorized transmission of protected data over a restricted channel, had triggered immediate protocol enforcement. Andros Bay had acted quickly. Kendric exhaled silently. This wasn't vengeance, it was justice catching up to arrogance. As they stepped off the plane, the humid weight of the island air greeted them, along with the subtle buzz of curiosity just outside the terminal. A press photographer, tipped by someone inside the agency, raised his lens and captured the moment Cray was led away in cuffs. The image, though not yet viral, would soon ignite a conversation beyond the confines of any boardroom. Near the arrival's gate, Bren Vassell approached Kendric, laptop already open, his expression focused but energized. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The board wants to fast-track the SCAA contract approval now." He turned the screen toward Kendric, showing a flurry of messages from key stakeholders. "They think this proves our tech is more dangerous to Alteron than we realized." Kendric stared at the screen for a beat, his jaw tightening, not with fear, but with resolve. "Then we build it faster," he said, voice low, every syllable edged with purpose. He turned to Kael and Laren, who stood beside him, still absorbing everything. Their faces were a mixture of awe, confusion, and courage, painted with the kind of clarity only truth reveals. Kendric dropped to one knee in front of them, lowering his voice to something only they could hear. "How would you two like to lead the next demo in Sanoro next month?" Both boys blinked, eyes widening. Laren leaned forward, hesitant. "Really?" "Absolutely," Kendric replied, his expression softening into something rare and warm. "Because if someone tried this hard to stop your voices, it means they're already powerful." Kael bit his lip, glancing toward where Cray had been taken. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "So, we didn't do anything wrong." Kendric placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, anchoring the boy in certainty. "No," he said with quiet conviction. "You did something right. You kept being exactly who you are, even when someone told you not to." His words held no anger, only truth polished by years of restraint, of battles fought without headlines. He looked from one son to the other, two futures forged not in silence but in soft, unyielding defiance. "And that," he said, "is how legacies begin, with defiance spoken softly but lived boldly." The news broke before sunrise. The headline splashed across major business outlets like a slap. Ex-COO of rival firm escorted off plane for harassing CEO's son's mid-flight. It was blunt, unignorable, and immediately viral. The accompanying article didn't just cite anonymous passengers, it included direct quotes from legal representatives at Virathon Systems and confirmed the identity of the man involved. Whitner Cray, once considered a titan of aerospace innovation. Inside the quiet of Kendric Marlow's home, the article loaded on his screen in clean, brutal font. He leaned over the breakfast counter, eyes skimming each paragraph, noting the carefully chosen phrasing. Targeted harassment, escalated incident, confirmed recording. He didn't flinch, didn't exhale, didn't smile. Across the kitchen, Kael and Laren were still asleep. For a moment it felt like a lull between waves. Later that afternoon, Kendric stood before a semicircle of journalists in the Virathon press atrium. No spotlights, just clarity. Dorian stood behind him, arms folded, watching like a sentinel. The twins, seated nearby in coordinated gray jackets, remained calm, alert. Cameras clicked. "We talk a lot about innovation," Kendric said, his voice level, "but very little about dignity. These boys reminded me it starts with listening, to young voices, to quiet resistance, and to the moment you realize silence is no longer the safer choice." His words didn't thunder. They landed softly, almost quietly, but they resonated. When the conference ended, Kendric placed a gentle hand on both sons' shoulders as reporters refrained from asking the boys questions. He'd made it clear. They were not to be treated as spectacle. Not this time. Not ever. That evening, back at home, the house was silent except for the low hum of the kitchen light. Kendric sat alone at the table, tablet in hand, a cooling cup of coffee beside him. His fingers hesitated for a second before opening the secure message Dorian had sent. The file's name was clinical, precise, suppression attempt 1142, Cray incident and corporate implications. But the subtitle hit differently, recorded and reviewed by Dorian Vale, Executive Guardian Protocol. Kendric leaned back, lips parting in a rare smile. Dorian hadn't just been watching. He had been documenting, safeguarding, preparing. Quiet power, wielded with purpose, just like him, just like the boys were learning to do. He was about to close the file when a soft knock came at the study door. It opened halfway, revealing both Kael and Laren, clutching a tablet of their own. Laren held it up with wide eyes. "Dad," he said, "we just got this." On the screen was an official email from the South Continent Air Alliance, a formal invitation addressed to the twins, by name. Not to Kendric, not to Dorian. To Kael and Laren Marlow. The message was short but powerful. "You are cordially invited to speak at the Junior Innovation Panel during the upcoming SCAA Summit. We believe your voices matter." Kael looked uncertain. "Do they want us just because of what happened?" Kendric shook his head slowly and waved them in. "No," he said, beckoning them closer. "They want you because of how you responded to what happened." He watched as they sat on either side of him, the flickering tablet light casting soft glows on their faces. Laren bit his lip. "So, we didn't do anything wrong." "No," Kendric said, this time kneeling down to their eye level, voice steady. "You did something right. You kept being exactly who you are, even when someone told you not to." The air was still. Outside, a jet passed high overhead, its engine a distant rumble. Kendric stood, placed a hand on each boy's shoulder, and looked toward the hallway where Dorian had quietly appeared, leaning against the frame with arms crossed and a tired smile. The unspoken bond passed between them, the kind that isn't forged through blood alone, but through shared vigilance. Kendric looked back at the closed laptop in front of him. He tapped it once, then closed the lid with finality. "They tried to silence the future," he whispered, "but the future had a brother watching from row 4. 3 weeks later, Kendric Marlow stood backstage in the hushed preparation area of the San Oro International Convention Center, smoothing the cuffs of his dark blazer as he watched his sons rehearse their final lines. Kael and Laren stood in front of a holographic display of their AI-driven drone interface, running through the cues with the practiced ease of boys who had grown used to attention, but never quite like this. The air around them pulsed with quiet tension, not from nerves, but from significance. This wasn't just another presentation. It was their first major public moment since the incident on Flight 1142 had gone viral. They were no longer just prodigies. They were the boys who hadn't backed down. Outside, the summit buzzed with hundreds of attendees, tech executives, startup founders, legal observers, and government delegates. Kendric scanned the room from behind the curtain, knowing this crowd wasn't just here for innovation updates. They were watching for something else. How Virathon would respond, strategically and symbolically, to Alteron's attempted suppression. A few rows in, Dorian Vale leaned forward in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He hadn't slept much in the last 72 hours, ever since Alteron's legal team had issued a veiled public statement framing Cray's behavior as emotionally distressed due to personal bereavement, and accusing Kendric of exploiting the incident for public sympathy. Kendric had refused to comment. Not once. The truth didn't need a rebuttal when it was already echoing worldwide, captured on video, witnessed by dozens, and dissected across every major business outlet. The evidence had already done the talking. Now they would do the showing. The lights dimmed. A soft chime rang through the hall. The twins stepped onto the stage with quiet confidence, Kael holding the controller, Laren managing the visuals. Their presentation walked the audience through the streamlined AI navigation protocol they had designed for micro-drone adaptation in disaster zones. The room was silent, absorbed. When Laren clicked to the final slide, it displayed a single phrase in white on black. "Innovation isn't loud, it's consistent." The room stood in applause. From his place near the side exit, Kendric allowed himself a single breath of relief until his tablet buzzed. A new message, secure line, unknown sender. He opened it. "Back off your policy push, or we pull the alliance deal. Deputy Chair, Alteron Dynamics." The breath caught in his chest, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity. The policy push referred to the formal draft Verathon had begun circulating, an in-flight conduct and equity protocol specifically designed for high-level tech summits. It proposed federal enforcement guidelines for aviation-related discrimination incidents, especially those targeting executives from marginalized communities. The kind of draft that, if adopted, could change how corporate travel and accountability worked forever. Clearly, it had struck a nerve. Kendric tilted the screen toward Dorian, who had already moved to stand beside him. Dorian's face didn't shift. He didn't speak. He simply pulled out his phone, typed a few words, and hit send. A ping confirmed the transmission, forwarded directly to a federal oversight contact in compliance investigations. "They thought the warning would work," Dorian said quietly, locking eyes with his brother, the crowd still cheering behind them. They forgot who was in the audience on Flight 1142. A confidential white paper, marked as Leaked Internal Analysis, surfaced across 3 major tech industry news sites at once. Its claim, Verathon Systems' AI drone tech contained embedded surveillance modules capable of real-time tracking beyond regulatory limits. The accusations were precise, technical, and damning. At first glance, they seemed legitimate: internal schematics, regulatory citations, and even mocked-up legal memos. But Kendric Marlow didn't flinch. He knew immediately. The report was a forgery. Inside Verathon's glass conference room, Kendric stood at the head of the table, silent as the board reviewed the damage. The twins' faces, plastered in pixelated stills from the flight, were now adjacent to headlines accusing their father's company of manufacturing unethical, autonomous surveillance systems. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. Instead, he looked to his brother, seated quietly across from him with a tablet already open. Dorian Vale had traced the source of the upload within 36 hours. "The metadata's a mess," he explained. "Whoever did this cloned our schematic style but forgot one thing. Our versioning codes don't use trailing glyphs." His fingers moved swiftly over the screen. "See this? It matches formatting used by a consultancy registered under the name Ferocian Analytics." He tapped again. "That's a shell, and it's inside Alteron's network." The room darkened. Not literally, but the mood shifted like clouds passing over glass. Bren Vassell, Verathon's legal strategist, stood slowly. "Then it's time," he said. "We file a federal injunction. Today." The motion passed unanimously. The legal machine roared to life. While court documents were prepared, Kendric made only one public comment. Cameras captured him beneath the Verathon insignia. Hands clasped, voice steady. "This isn't about vengeance, it's about integrity." No elaboration, no bait taken. But away from the podium, A quieter storm was building. Letters began to arrive, 3 handwritten, addressed to Kael and Laren. They came from different cities, different boys, each letter in childlike scrawl. I saw what happened on the plane. I didn't know other kids went through this too. I'm scared to talk when I fly. The twins sat at the kitchen table reading the letters while Kendric watched from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He watched Kael's fingers trace one shaky sentence and Lauren's eyes linger on the final signature. From Jamie, age 9. That night, Kendric made a decision. At the next board meeting, he stood with more resolve than ever before. "We're not just fighting Alteron," he said. "We're building something they can't counterfeit." He outlined Project Echoline, an educational initiative to protect, mentor, and elevate young innovators, especially those from marginalized communities, during international travel and conferences. "The goal isn't just safety," he added, "it's amplification." Some directors were hesitant. "It's too soon," one said. "Too emotional," said another, but Kendric shook his head. "It's overdue." The board approved it by day's end. The name, Echoline, was inspired by the boys' first AI drone prototype, still housed in Kendric's home lab. That night, Kael walked in as his father reviewed the initial rollout documents. "Why call it Echoline?" he asked, standing barefoot in the doorway. Kendric turned in his chair. "Because when you speak into silence," he said softly, "you need something that carries your voice forward." Laren entered next, holding one of the letters again. "Will it help kids like Jamie?" Kendric smiled. "That's the plan." Outside the window, lights blinked from the rooftop antenna of the lab across the street. The world moved on, fast and unbothered. But inside the house, something had shifted. Not just in policy, but in posture. Virathon was no longer reacting. They were redefining the field. In the days that followed, inquiries began pouring in from youth groups, educational boards, and even a few nervous corporate executives who had quietly faced similar incidents. Kendric answered them all with the same tone, firm, measured, hopeful. But beneath it ran something deeper, resolve hardened by the knowledge that this attack wasn't about technology. It was about silencing potential before it could rise. He walked past his son's room late one evening, hearing the familiar clack of a keyboard and a soft laugh from Laren. On Kael's monitor, a prototype interface labeled EchoCom 1.0 blinked to life. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment, breathing in the sound of his son's resilience, echoed not in speeches, but in code. "And now," he said, "the echoes are coming back stronger than ever." The words echoed through the stark gray marble of the Federal Oversight Courtroom, the air unnaturally still as the final judgment landed like a gavel through glass. The hearing room wasn't large, no cameras, no reporters inside, just a row of suited compliance officers, 2 legal observers, and Cray himself, arms crossed, jaw locked, watching his empire quietly slip into obscurity. The verdict was clear: disbarment from all defense contracting, a 10-year executive board ban, and full forfeiture of pending consultant royalties. Kendric didn't shift in his seat. He hadn't come for vindication. He hadn't come to watch Cray fall. He came because presence mattered, and because silence, once weaponized against his sons, was something he refused to offer his adversary now. When called to speak, Kendric stood only long enough to deliver a single line: "We move forward." Then he stepped down and walked out of the room, leaving the weight of justice exactly where it belonged, behind him. But the hallway held its own surprises. Just outside the courtroom, in a corridor flanked by brass security cameras and silent guards, a man stepped forward from the shadows. He wore a pressed gray blazer and held a thin leather folio. Older, white, maybe late 40s, his voice trembled slightly. "I have twins, too," he said, stopping Kendric mid-stride. Kendric turned, brows slightly raised, still composed from the hearing. The man swallowed. I used to tell them to stay quiet on planes. Sit still. Don't draw attention." Kendric regarded him for a moment, studying him not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity. "And now?" he asked. The man's eyes softened and a wry, almost embarrassed smile crossed his face. "Now, I tell them to speak louder, just in case someone else needs the courage." Kendrick's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, less guarded, more human. He nodded once, saying nothing, and continued down the hall. The exchange lingered with him longer than he expected, not because it was profound, but because it was rare, a recognition, a ripple. That night, Dorian sat in his home office surrounded by monitors, the pale blue light of his systems glowing against the glass walls. He updated the Guardian protocol silently, fingers tapping keys with the precision of someone who had spent years threading truth through firewalls. New parameters blinked into place. Flag any passenger displaying indirect silencing behaviors toward minors, especially patterns of complaint, unsolicited confrontation, or implied behavioral correction within transit spaces. It wasn't revenge, it was infrastructure. A silent shield for the next Kendric, Kael, or Laren. Across the house, the laughter of young voices spilled from a half-cracked bedroom door. Kendric walked quietly past, pausing for a moment to peer in. Kael and Laren sat cross-legged on their carpet, a glowing interface between them, lines of code scrolling like a conversation in motion. They were designing something. Bright blue icons blinked on a tablet screen beside them. Travel safety profiles, reactive alert triggers, and interface nodes designed to interact with in-flight systems. Viathon's next-gen travel safety interface. And the twins weren't just contributing, they were leading. Kendric leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching without interrupting. Every giggle, every whispered joke between variables and logic gates became its own form of resistance. This wasn't just about protecting the future, it was about raising it, coding it, naming it. He thought about how close they had come to being shamed into silence, how close he himself had come to letting things slide in the name of civility. He remembered Cray's smirk, Marin's hesitation, Halvin's moment of indecision. And then he remembered Kael's quiet voice saying, "You told us to stop talking because you didn't like how we looked." That truth had hit harder than any verdict, because it wasn't born in a courtroom, it was born in a child's observation. As Kendric stepped away, the soft clicking of keys and bubbling laughter followed him down the hall like a private symphony. A sound only he had waited his whole life to hear. Boys, safe and brilliant, creating something the world hadn't yet earned, but deeply needed. Because sometimes victory doesn't look like a courtroom, it sounds like a giggle behind a keyboard. The rain had just stopped when the Marlow family stepped through the glass entryway of the newly built Echoline exhibition hall in Andros Bay. The silence inside was more sacred than quiet. Polished tile floors absorbed each footfall, and soft light from overhead panels cast a glow across the walls of engraved names. There was no podium, no audience, no press flashes, just presence. Kael and Laren walked ahead of their father, their formal shoes tapping gently as they approached the backlit wall. Row by row, name by name, the boys traced their fingers across each engraving, identities of children who had, like them, been silenced, dismissed, or displaced while traveling. Some were stories they had read about in the months since Flight 1142. Others were unfamiliar, but now immortalized in steel. At the center of the wall stood a simple phrase etched in brushed aluminum. Your voice was never too loud. Kendric watched his sons pause, then reach into a small case and pull out a slim bronze plaque. Working together, they slid it into a designated slot beneath their names, Kael Marlow and Laren Marlow, just beneath the section titled First Flight, First Stand. As the plaque clicked into place, Kael exhaled softly. Laren reached over and adjusted it by a fraction, making sure it sat straight. Their movements were careful, deliberate. Not for show, but for legacy. Behind them, Dorian Vale stepped forward, dressed in a sharp black suit, a small envelope tucked beneath his arm. He offered it to Kendric with no ceremony, just quiet purpose. "This came through this morning," he said, his voice low. Kendric took the envelope, unfolded the single page inside, and read the words silently. "Official clearance granted. Guardian protocol approved for cross-platform deployment." His eyes remained fixed on the words for a moment. Then he folded the page and slipped it into his jacket's inner pocket. "You kept the promise," Kendric said, turning slightly toward his brother. "Always," Dorian replied, his tone firm, like a seal pressed in wax. The three men, two brothers and a legacy just beginning, stood for a moment longer. Then they left the hall, not looking back. The sound of the door closing behind them was soft, but it felt like the final note of a song that would now echo for years. Back at the terminal, the family boarded their return flight. No fanfare, just seat numbers and gate calls. The cabin was quiet this time, more aware somehow. Passengers greeted the boys with subtle nods and brief smiles, recognition without intrusion. Kendric settled into seat 2A, the same one he had occupied 6 months earlier. Only this time, his sons took 2B and 2C with a different kind of posture. No longer children clinging to calm, but young men seated in pride. As the aircraft ascended through pale cloud banks, Laren leaned slightly toward his father and whispered, "Dad, what if someone tells us to stop talking again?" Kendric turned to face him fully. The hum of the engines filled the quiet between them. Then he smiled and looked toward seat 2A, where his boys now sat proudly. "Then I hope you talk even louder, because you never know who's listening from row 4. Seconds later, their uncle stood, his voice sharp enough to freeze the entire aisle. The passengers' confidence evaporated, the crew backed away, and the power dynamic flipped instantly. If you believe real authority protects without fear and restores respect in moments, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, disrespect, and the sudden shift in accountability when assumptions meet authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and protecting every family with dignity.